This board made it crystal clear that you wanted this to be an open and transparent process that produced districts that had small deviations using the best possible data. That was what you asked. That's not what you've gotten from your administration or from your consultant.
The big question you hear a lot from folks saying, well, why don't you just wait till the census in 2020? And that would be, and so I'm going to answer it for you. And the answer is, that'd be the easy thing to do because, thank you.
We should use the 2020 census that's coming from the federal government.
Why not appear to be reasonable, wait until after the census, and do it transparently and right?
We don't need to do no redistricting until the census come out.
You can wait till the next census.
Frankly, there was a pretty flamboyant article in the paper a week ago Sunday, and it insinuated that a Mr. Doty, who I have never met or heard of, told the county commission that we shouldn't do this.
Finally, about Mr. Richard Doty. He is a recognized expert in the field of population forecasting. Estimating population at the neighborhood level is so difficult to do accurately that redistricting contractor Rich Doty said, wait until 2021 because there's no good way to do it. That was my flat-out response. He said, in recalling that he recommended the county wait to redraw commission district boundaries until 2020 census.
How can you trust a consultant that does not alert you to the fact a subcontractor, in this case Mr. Doty from the University of Florida, Bureau of Economic and Business Research, cautioned against doing this?
We're going to have the census in a year. In 2020, we're going to have the census. 2021, we're going to be back at the drawing board doing redistricting.
Why spend taxpayer dollars now when redistricting will occur in 2021?
I think it's a waste of money. I've looked it up. It's at least $16,000 and as much as $50,000 to do this.
It's a year before the census, which would have real numbers. But you don't want real numbers. You want expensive, educated guesses before the census.
Many of you have claimed to be fiscal conservatives. Well, let's talk about the spending. We're going to do this again in 2021 with better data, with better citizen input. But no, let's do it now. Let's waste that money.
I think it's been a waste of taxpayer money to move forward this year, and that the motives for doing so are highly questionable.
And I'm prepared to demonstrate over 1,000 serious flaws that render these estimates useless. There's a systematic underestimation of the Hispanic population that leads to diluted minority voting power if you accept these estimates. There's a systematic underestimation of North County populations. There's a systematic overestimation of South County populations. These mistakes cannot and do not even themselves out. If you use these estimations, you are telling us that you believe 25% margin of errors do not matter. And you will be saying that in the North County, on the top sheet, all of those areas in red, a total throughout the county of 1,500 blocks representing 20% of the total population in the county are neighborhoods that have lost population since 2010. Okay. That's what you will be saying the math says.
On September 29th, the front page headline for the Herald said, "Flawed data underpins maps."
The revised data presented today, including the revised maps, are still not reliable. By the consultant's own words, there are, quote, anomalies, end quote, at the block level.
If you listen to what the gentleman said he did was he had Bieber data, and after he did all these other machinations over here, if it didn't agree with the Bieber data, he just plugged the number in to make his machinations equal the Bieber data. I work with a bunch of engineers. That's called a fudge factor. You didn't need to spend $50,000 to have this guy fudge number to the Bieber numbers.
Underestimating the county-wide Hispanic population by more than 30% and underestimating the black population by 20% makes the consultant's second set of estimates indefensible. It makes the maps that derive from those estimates indefensible.
At every step when the facts and constituent feedback contradicted the wisdom of proceeding, you have chosen to proceed regardless. I am particularly appalled at the statements by members of this commission dismissing the validity of the online survey. The survey was actively promoted by the county as an alternative to district meetings. Over 2,000 citizens provided feedback, including over 300 written comments. Yet Commissioner Dietert was quoted as saying, "What's more telling is the 5 meetings where we only had 84 people." As a businessman and a father, my schedule is overflowing. I chose to provide my feedback online rather than in person. If you do not intend to accept the results of online submissions, then do not solicit them. And I will take time away from my business and my family to make my voice heard as I have today. It adds further insult that the Commission rapidly and enthusiastically embraced a map anonymously submitted online.
You, the Commission, represent us, the people, and should honor the will of the people.
And the popular will has spoken, and it has said no to this rigged process. It has said no to taking Newtown and disenfranchising them. It has said no to creating maps that favor you individually politically. It has said no to the 4th map submitted by a questionable subject. It has said no to this entire process, and all along, you guys have said, no, we're not going to listen. We're going to continue on our merry way, insulting our constituents, ignoring their comments, and doing as we wish.
The law was very clear. 10% and over is presumed impermissible. 10% or below is presumed okay. Our staff ran the numbers, and it was just right below 10%.
It began with dismissing the ESRI data when it showed less than 10% differences.
I believe the whole process to justify redistricting now is a sham. It's really not required. The very original maps were under 10% difference between the districts, and you don't have to use flawed data to chisel them down a few points.
I'd first like to talk about the precedent for using population as a reason to redistrict and reapportion. The cases that created this standard and oftentimes were in cases where people had not redistricted in over 60 years, and in cases where districts were 3 times the size of its directly neighboring district. Far and large examples are what define this. But even in the case that refers to the 10% safe harbor of deviation between districts, that was after a legislative body specifically drew those districts, and that's when it was challenged. I do not believe that the 10% applies to this situation as something that has occurred naturally by growth.
You don't need this. There's no lawsuit that's going to come if you don't redistrict. You don't need to do it. The law doesn't compel it. I strongly disagree with the interpretation of the Supreme Court decision.
Perhaps you couldn't care less about the will of the people. Maybe you don't care about the over 60% of Sarasotans that voted in favor of single-member districts. Maybe you don't even care about the 10,000 black folks not voting in 2020 if you adopt that map. But if you care about protecting yourselves against a federal lawsuit, and if you care about protecting our taxpayer dollars, I highly encourage that you listen to these folks behind me wearing these red and white shirts that say rigged and do the right thing. Thank you.
This appears to be a direct violation of Shelby v. Holder, and that is a leading Voting Rights Act decision. I'm sure you've heard of it during your discussions. I'd ask for you to take a review of it.
I'm not an expert in redistricting law. From what I've heard here, however, there seems to be quite a bit of dispute as to whether this should go forward at all and whether the methodologies employed are compliant with the legal requirements. Moreover, there's a minority issue going on in here. So I'm going to just tell you that if I were hired, I would file an action for a writ of prohibition in the appropriate court and have you come before a judge to explain yourselves.
And I don't care nothing about these maps, because you shouldn't be talking about drawing maps. This is about what this really is. It is about voter suppression.
And what it does to the black community in District 1, and says, no, you don't get to vote. You didn't get to vote 2 years ago. You're not going to get to vote next year. Your democracy is deferred. And I don't think that's legal.
How are you going to look yourselves in the mirror when you take the largest majority minority area of this county and put them out of a district that is going to be voting in 2020 and put them in 2022?
You know, it will give the people of Newtown the opportunity to participate and vote. You know, the Supreme Court says the right to vote is the most protected among all other rights. For it's our very democracy that our community and our state and country relies on.
So the facts of this redistricting effort, as I understand them, seem to tell us one thing. Historically underrepresented communities of color, our fellow black and African American citizens, could very likely be disenfranchised by the redistricting effort as it stands now.
While the Sarasota County Commission has broad authority to redistrict, whether it makes sense or not, that authority does not permit, and I repeat, does not permit returning to the unjust disenfranchising policies of our past.
In my opinion, Fred Atkins' candidacy is at the root of this controversy. The redistricting seems designed to undermine the citizen referendum that overwhelmingly voted to switch to district representation from county-wide elections. Why are you afraid of Fred?
I believe the map is drawn with color in mind, but red versus blue, not black versus white. I am not a supporter of single-member districts, but 60% of the electorate voted for them, so it seems wrong for me, for you to put your fingers on the scales to tip the balance in favor of the status quo by changing those districts before a single election has taken place or any updated population data has been validated.
Alternative Map 1 does the best job of balancing the populations with less risk of changing the election outcome. Regardless of intent, Alternative 2 and 3 flip District 1's net party registration advantage from Democrat to Republican.
If one wanted to help a Republican candidate win District 1 in 2020, moving Precinct 233 would be the strongest choice.
And I knew from the beginning it was Bob Wechter. He did this in 2011. He drew your current districts, not just as any citizen. I think one of you said any citizen has a right to draw a map. You know Bob Wechter's not any citizen. He's the henchman for the developer cabal that pulls the strings behind the scenes in selecting candidates and bankrolling them to election. You know that's true.
It's going to benefit Mr. Wechter the best, and it's going to benefit Mr. Gabbard the best. And what will that give them? That's going to give them the ultimate freeway to probably build the dump that he wants. And also, redistricting enables all of you and the future commissioners to sell off the quads around the celery fields, as we know you want to.
It is true that District 1 has 400 more registered Democrats than Republicans. Yet in 2018, 800 more Republicans came out to vote than Democrats in District 1, and they voted for single-member districts. My point is that single-member districts was voted on by both Republicans and Democrats. I realize this may bother you, that Republicans reject the at-large form of Sarasota County government in favor of single-member districts. They clearly want our commissioners to represent us and not the special interests. The process of redistricting is obviously tied into that single-member district.
I just wanted to let you know that I think you're being incredibly wasteful of our time, of our money. We voted for single districts. It passed. And then we get this.
The only thing out of multiple hours of input, the only thing that's worth taking away, in my opinion, is that the people from Newtown want to keep it as it is.
Wait to the 2020 census.
I have to request the commissioners to delay redistricting until after the census.
Forget about this redistricting also until after the census. It would make more sense, and I think your data would be more correct.
The census is coming. That's going to be accurate data because they're going to go out and actually count those individuals.
Leave the maps as they were until after the census.
Do not force through redistricting based on flawed data and tainted process. Wait until accurate data is available from the 2020 census.
We should rather wait for accurate population numbers after the 2020 census. Otherwise, it's obviously fiscally irresponsible, and we know the process is flawed.
United States Census Bureau is a nation's scientific think tank whose focus is data.
The 2020 census data is the more reliable data. The data is more available to them. It's less costly to us as taxpayers. More employees, more resources are available to the U.S. Census to be able to ensure that the population estimates are more reliable.
And once the census figures come out, let's get into drawing the new districts the way they ought to be.
I'll give you power.